Okay. Dr.
There
Collins,
it is.
welcome on this platform. We're very, very happy to have you here. It is the last session. We've passed the graveyard now, but we believe you will entertain us. Okay, I hand over to you. The platform is yours now.
Well, that's nice. You see, those years at Onderstepoort, according to the Human Sciences Research Council, the veterinary degree from Onderstepoort is the hardest degree in the country in terms of sheer volume of work has to go through. That's a given. The most intellect required, the same report goes, is from chemical and electrical engineering. So when each evening at about 1:30 in the morning, when I stopped swatting for those 5 years, I swore that one day, 5 o'clock, and not 5 o'clock, on every Friday at midday, I would relax and have a dop. So this bottle in J&B, I think, is just about finished. We started at lunchtime. So let's have a go at what I'm going to tell you as to why you should be a vet. Why a vet? And thank you, Chris and Helene and Corlia, for giving me this opportunity. Why a dairy vet? Right. If you've got any doubt, dairy vets are sprightly at the age of 45. And that's because of the wonderful life we live. This is a picture of my partner. Now, my partner for the first 30 years of my life, Peter Collier, he grew up in Joburg. His father was a brewer, one of the first brewers for South African breweries. And this picture actually was the cover of his funeral service. We had a 35-year made in heaven partnership. It was absolutely fantastic, and it reminds so much of people of the James Herriot story, where James was the young vet and Siegfried was his older, wiser partner. So what I'm getting at now, because I was brought up on a dairy farm about 120 k's towards Durban from here in Underberg, where I am. And this was our dairy farm. There was our dairy parlor there with the thatched roof. There was our milk tanker, the donkey called Joseph, and an old cart, and Dingendauer, our African milking machine, African, not African, and one of our vast herd of 8 cows. And that's the sort of place I grew up. And that's the view from our front lawn, and our Irish setter, which suffered from hypoparathyroidism, so I learned. And right at the right of this picture, well, it's just out of scene there with our names and so on, was a school I went to for 2 years with 8 other barefoot farm kids. And so what I'm getting at here is that Peter came from the center of a city, and I came from this wonderful farm country life. And so it doesn't really matter. Peter Collier and my present two, well, I've just left practice, my present two partners also grew up in the city. So one's background really doesn't matter, so long as you've got that, that's in your heart, what you'd like to be. After I'd left school and done my army training, I actually had no idea what I was going to do. I was either going to be a farmer or a game ranger or a beekeeper, funny enough. Peel's Honey, who most of you have heard of, Mr. John Peel was my foster father. My dad died when I was 5. He had been in the First World War. Anyhow, so I had no idea what I was going to do. Farming, game ranging, might have been a beekeeper. Anyhow, after my army training, we did 9 months in those days, I put the rucksack on my back. I hitchhiked up to Rhodesia, as it was there, and I thumbed lifts all over the country, and people were wonderful to us. I had South African put on the backpack, and it was superb. I stayed free everywhere. Anyone who gave me a lift insisted that I stay the night with their homes. This particular shot was taken in the Chumani Mani Mountains. I was already, as a little boy, mad keen on mountaineering. So there I was, hitchhiking around, and one day I got a lift with a farmer down in the Lowveld near Nuvanetsi. I don't know what the new name is. And he was on a buying round for weaner cattle. And I went with him round and about. And then at one of the farms we were at, we spent the night on the farm, the ranch. And one of the stockmen came in one morning while we were having breakfast, out of breath, and said, there are a whole lot of cattle that are dead on a Mapani tree covered hill. So we saddled up some horses and cantered across to this hill, and there, sure enough, were these corpses of these cows. So the farmer, I still remember his name, John Mitchell, and I, and John Mitchell was the chap that was taking me around, and the farmer and I, we pulled out our pocket knives. I've always carried a pocket knife since I can remember as a little boy. And we started cleansering, cutting up these cattle. And John Mitchell stood upright, shook his head at us with a smile on his face, and he said, guys, I don't really know what the hell I'm doing here, what to look for. And so did the farmer. He said, I've seen the odd vet cut up cattle. And I kid you not, I had, that is a picture of Saul on his way to Damascus, when the Lord appeared to him in a flash and turned Saul around from hating the early Christians. And he turned around, as we know, to become the greatest evangelist of all time and wrote most of the second half of the New Testament. When we were on that hill in Rhodesia, cutting up those cattle, I had road to Damascus flash like that. And I knew what I was going to do for the rest of my life. And that was in 1967. So that is, was that 53 years ago? Yeah. And obviously, part of enjoying the life of being a dairy vet is enjoying cattle. And this is a picture I used for one of the talks I gave. I think it was the one when Chris van Dijk asked me to speak at the Large Herds Conference. And one of the sort of themes I was punting was taking minute or minute vacations every day. You've got to have time out, even if it's for 30 seconds or half a minute. And you might be running around very stressed. Take time to let a calf suckle your fingers. It's the most rewarding, lovely thing. And I'm sure even old Bucky Sporter or Eben Etzebeth, you get a mushy, soft feeling of delight when a little calf sucks your fingers. But there's so much more in our lives as dairy vets that gives us this wonderful pleasure and this attachment to nature. And I'm going to talk about this as one of the great, great advantages of we dairy vets, or vets in the country. This is a book that was written by Richard Louv called The Last Child in the Woods. And it's saving our children from nature deficit disorder. Now, nature deficit disorder, the psychiatrists and psychologists world over are realizing it's becoming a more and more serious condition. Mankind is losing touch with our natural environment. And this is a bull of a book to read. I just read the sort of summaries of each chapter, and it's stunning. I mean, not only kids, but adults, prisoners who are, they looked at, I think it was 90,000 inmates in American prisons, and they compared those whose cells looked out onto another building with those prisoners whose cells looked out onto maybe a bit of grass, maybe a bit of water or a tree. And the difference between those two groups was phenomenal in terms of sheer physical well-being and certainly mental well-being. And they're not even barefooted on the ground, as we should be barefooted every day on our lawns or on muddy paths or streams or something. So that's what our kids, we country vets, give our kids such a lift off. My oldest daughter is in the banking world in London. She gets dressed up in a pinstripe suit and high-heeled shoes and catches the train to London, and then goes to about the 25th story in the banking world. She just struck it lucky and found her niche, and now works for the Bank of Norway, by the way. But since COVID, they've worked from home, and their kids go into the local woods and streams and catch frogs. Funny enough, this picture here, my little grandson, Matthew Todd, he just loves frogs and nature. So that's one of the advantages, really and truly, and it's important because really we live for our kids, that we dairy vets can bless our children with. Now, let's get back to dairying. On the right, this big fat chap is a very good friend of mine, Paul Mead. He's a local rep, I think, for ABS, one of the big semen companies in the world. And Paul went across, he's a bachelor, by the way, but he owns 8 bull mastiffs, and he loves dogs, but his bedside breeding is bull catalogs and semen catalogs and so on. And he went across and he wanted to see, and I believe at that time, that particular cow, who was a daughter of the bull Planet. I grew up also reading magazines, because I grew up in the country, magazines of bull, in bull catalogs. Planet, that cow, I think a couple of days before Paul got there, had produced 120 kilograms of milk in one day. Obviously three milkings and total mixed ration. She certainly doesn't have to walk out onto the pastures as our cows do where I practice. Anyhow, Paul's a great friend of mine. And that's, as I'm going to mention that later on about our friendships. Now, I was invited by Chris van Dijk at a relatively late stage to talk at the 2017 Large Herds Conference, because one of the speakers had pulled out. His father was dying in the UK, so the speaker had to go back. And Chris asked me to fill in the gap and speak on something wishy-washy, Lucy, wishy-washy stuff like stress and personalities and that. And I thought, no, man, I've been a large animal vet for all these years, and I've got a particular interest in fertility and all that sort of stuff. So I decided to hang with what Chris wanted me to talk on. I will talk what I really enjoy, and I've studied, and I've been so impressed with this topic that's now it's a sort of cutting edge, and you young students, colleagues in a year or two's time, will know a lot about this stuff. So I decided to speak, and this is this picture I put on this huge screen in this hall. There are about 500 or 600 delegates. I tell you, I put myself. So I'll put this on the screen. The cytological effects on the primordial oocyst by high levels of non-esterified fatty acids in high-producing Holstein cows on our pastures with high levels of nitrogen. And I believe in this. And I believe it's one of the big factors in our fertility problems. Why I'm particularly interested in this, at one of these conferences I went, I think it was in Mossel Bay some years ago, there was a lecturer, a young guy, but also very dynamic. And he described what they are doing. You won't believe this, or I certainly didn't. They've got little pipettes, almost the width of a human hair. They've got pipettes. And they go into not only the ovaries of these cows, they go into the primordial oocysts, and they suck out bits of fluid, and they analyze them for these nephers. Now, if that's not modern science, then I don't know what it is. And so I was just bowled over by this, and I've been thinking about it ever since. And this is why our high-producing cows, one of the reasons that we can attack it. Anyhow, so I put this on the screen. But I also put on, which is my next picture, because I'd sent this to Paul Mead, that big semen fundi. I sent it to Paul and I said, this is what I'm going to talk about. What do you think? So his response was this. Holy shit. I tell you, that audience, from having all their eyelids drooping down over their eyes when I gave out that big the announcement, when I put this on the screen, I mean, they just collapsed in laughter and everyone relaxed. And thereafter, I think I had the audience, I won't say in the palm of my hand, but we had a lovely, lovely presentation. And this is a lovely picture. I like to say this is a cow that's now been milking for 420 odd days, and she's just been released. She's had dry cow intramammary put in her. She's been dried off. She's now got 2 months. I like 2 months, a full 60 days dry period, to go and relax and prepare for the next lactation. In her, where is the pointer? In her belly is a 7-month-old calf fetus, and her udders had a hell of a lactation, producing all that milk. Her liver is probably fairly fatty acids from the highly nitrogenized pastures and all the concentrates that she's had to eat, all that starch and so on. She's going to go out and repair, but not onto lush ryegrass. This is one thing I believe, and I'm very sad that so much of something that we've got in such abundance, especially in our dairy areas even, although they try and plow every square inch into artificial pastures. This is what we've got in such abundance, and natural felt. This is Themeda triandra, rooigras, redgrass, and it's what that cow needs. You know, in the abattoirs, so Willem Schultheis, I remember, gave us a talk once. Dairy cows that come in for slaughter, and I know from doing so many dairy cow postmortems, the rumens are chock-a-block with these, well, mostly healed rumen ulcers. And so many of our postmortems of our adult milking cows have got liver abscesses, huge liver abscesses, that so often, I think, corrode through the vena cava, would that be right? And this thick Corynebacterial, whatever the latest designation for that bacterium is, goes in and circulates, and a clot of it, because it gets quite hard, lodges in the heart or the brain, and they die of a stroke or a heart attack. Anyhow, so when they go out onto that lovely rooigras, they've got a chance for their rumens to recover, their udders to get over the stress of all that milking, and the livers, of course, to recuperate. And of course, this is very important, the next round of follicles are getting ready, because remember, it takes a couple of months before that follicle that's going to become the next calf is already being selected. So that's one thing that I picked up, and this is through reading journals and going to meetings and so on. I'm not that clever enough to think all that stuff myself, although I wish I were. Meetings. I was very fortunate to be chosen by Boehringer Ingelheim. I don't mind giving them a punt because I love their products. Sent 3 of us. In fact, one of the first speakers on this dairy school this week on Monday came across. It was Gordon Adam. Now they come from a huge practice down in the Cape. I don't know how many vets Gordon and as well as Dad, John, who was a year ahead of me at OP, they run a huge, big business practice with lots of vets and lots of satellite practices. And we've also got a huge practice in Natal, which has spread enormously. As I said, I started just with Peter Collier and myself. Peter came here, and his practice, like so many rural practices, started just to do TB and CA work. And although the herds are very small in those days, probably 60 cows being milked, but each cow had to be bled without these vacuum tubes that we're blessed with these days, but with little brown bottles about that big, and you stick a biggish old silver record needle into the cow's jugular, and the blood would trickle out, and you'd collect it in this brown bottle. And the TB testing too was so onerous, because there was a journal that every cow, every beast on the farm from 6 months and up had to be recorded in there, and the skin thickness measured with that caliper and written down before you gave the TB injection. And again, 72 hours later, it had to be re-measured and re-recorded. And each year, the farmer would have to account for those cattle that didn't appear on the TB register. So that sort of was the bread and butter that got rural practices established. And then gradually, so-called the sort of herd health and us being involved. But anyhow, this was so wonderful to go to the American Association of Bovine Practitioners, the AABP conference in Albuquerque. Fantastic. And we mingled, and the three of us went there, Darby, Killian, myself, and Gordon, and of course, Barry Coates. And we met vets, mostly from the States, but from all over the world. Networking. Networking is one of the most wonderful and useful things. And I urge you guys, even if you belong to, was it the green part of Lucy's presentation? If you're less reluctant to mix, no, it wasn't the green, it was the owl, the owl, I call it the owl one, the more analytical. Doesn't really like sort of to be so gregarious. But I want to, if you don't mind, I'm going to tell you of a guy, us older vets, because I wasn't, not young now, but I wasn't that much younger then when I went, just 2015. We were having a beer afterwards at one of the local taverns, and about 7 or 8 of us, and of course they wanted to know all about South African dairy. And I told them, I gave them the lowdown on my little practice in the hills here and our bigger practices, and they were stunned, quite honestly. They thought we our South African dairy farmers have got half a dozen cows that are tied up under a thorn tree and milked by hand. And I said, no, no, no. Our herds are now sort of 500, 700, 8,000, 800, 1,000, 2,000 cows. And we're using the same genetics that you guys are. And I rattled off all the names because I know the bulls pretty well around the world. And they really had their hair and their socks blown back. And anyhow, one of these vets, an oldish, quietest chap, nodded thoughtfully. And because I think the other chap said, you know, we get involved, and I'll mention that shortly, we're involved with families and managers on the farms because you're on these farms so often. And like our city counterparts who don't necessarily get to know their clients that well. And he said, let me tell you a story. Because I also said, it's not necessarily farming. You don't get a vet generation after generation following in their father's or their mother's footsteps. He said, let me tell you a story. My grandfather was a vet where I still am. And his little practice was very, very intimate with the little farming families. And one lunchtime, he sat on the park bench because they lived a little way out of this village. And he was eating his favorite lunch, which was home-baked bread with thick thick butter and honey. He loved honey because they had their own beehives. That's why I say I nearly became a beekeeper. And next to him came a young mother, housewife, and a little son called Tommy. It was Mrs. Mitchell and Tommy. And she said, hi, Doc, do you mind if we sat next to you for lunchtime? He said, yeah, sure, Helen, whatever her name was. How's it? And hello, little Tommy, because, you know, you get to know all the kids and so on. And they were chatting, asking how the goat was that Tommy had brought in and how the cows were and so on, just normal vet dairy farmer talk. And little Tommy then shouted, Doc, watch out. And there on the vet's finger was a bee, obviously lapping up a little bit of honey that had got onto his finger. And instead of just flicking the bee off, just flicking it off, he took the trouble in saying, no, wait a bit, Tommy, come and have a look at this close up. So he brought it to Tommy's eye and he said, look at this bee. It's not going to sting me. It's busy getting some food, some honey off my hand. And look at the legs. There, those little hairs on the back legs. It's going to get pollen. And it'll take that pollen and it'll pollinate, whether it's a corn crop or an orange crop. And he said, those bees are so important to us on planet Earth. They keep us going, all our fruit and vegetables and flowers and so on. I'll stop there because Tommy Mitchell got a master's and then a doctorate, a PhD in entomology in bees, apiarist. Mitchell Honey Farms today are the biggest single beekeeping organization in the States. They sponsor vast scholarships, they're at the cutting edge of the use of propolis and honey and so on for human health and whatnot. And all because of that little moment that vet took to explain to Tommy that bees are not something to be scared of. They're actually wonderful creatures. So that's again one of the wonderful things that we country vets have the opportunity to influence other people like that. And I give a talk calling the butterfly moment. It's from a book that I read once about how one little action, you never know the ultimate response to that. So that's the story about Tommy. And as I say, that vet's son took over, and his son ended up sitting next to me having a beer in Albuquerque. This is, as we all know, this is Professor Tim Noakes, the great sports scientist. He was born, funny enough, within 20 days of myself. We've both got the first name of Timothy. We've both run the Comrades Marathon about 14 or 15 times. As I say, we were born together, so we're literally twins. And I was the master of ceremonies at that conference up in Sibaya, wherever it was. And the most humble, nice bloke you could get to meet. And I know he was shafted by the press and by some of the people about his recommendations on the diet. But really all he was punting was that we should eat a hell of a lot less refined carbohydrates, and we can eat a lot more animal fats and proteins. But, you know, this is, again, one of the perks of being a vet, a dairy vet. And everybody that was at that conference, nobody can forget Tim Noakes. And we're actually good friends now, and we contact each other. And again, networking. I developed, funny enough, on one of my Comrades Marathons, I suffered my second panic attack. It was an extraordinary thing. And I duly began to be a panic attack sufferer, which turned, it's a strange animal, this, and it turned into bipolar. And I suffer from bipolarism, and I'm not at all shy to talk about it. And I talk about it with my clients and friends, and it's destigmatizing these mental, emotional things. I often say when people sort of frown and say, wow, golly, you suffer from bipolarism. I say, well, some people have got ingrowing toenails. Some people have got diabetes. Some people need to wear glasses because they're short-sighted. Some people have got fat bums, and some of us suffer from bipolarism. So please pass the salt. Okay, I was also asked by Zoetis once for our practice. I don't know why they chose our practice. They're much bigger and probably much more financially successful practices in KZN. But we were asked to talk about the success factor in my practice. They had a road show, and they went around South Africa to each province or area and picked one practice. So Gavin and Rob and I sat down and said, right, what do you guys think are the success factors in our practice? So we decided as a dairy practice, primarily dairy practice, cutting edge technology. I'm going to avoid that whiskey glass. I'll just have water. Cutting edge technology, keep up to date. This is exciting stuff. The new pharmaceuticals that come out. You know, when I was doing a locum in London, soon after I'd qualified, a rep came in and said, oh, so because he'd heard I was interested in ending up in livestock practice. Have you heard of this new drug or product called prostaglandins, Estromate? And I mean, it had only just been discovered then. And over the years, how these new products are developing, but at the same time, they're now getting forbidden. And so we, or you up and coming colleagues, are going to have to, you know, balance things out where you go to use these new pharmaceuticals, hormones particularly. I know in the States, they're very strict. And I know I've used in my life a lot of estrogens, estrogen cypionate, for instance. I use it very nicely. But in the States, it's banned. And at that conference, when we were talking about the drugs we use, and they said, wow, you're lucky to still be allowed to use injectable estrogens. And obviously, cutting edge technology, surgical procedures, displaced abomasums. I still lie the cow on her back. My partners do them standing. from the side, surgical procedures, attending CPD courses. You know, when CPD came out and became compulsory, I pooped myself. I was really terrified. It added to my stress levels big time. But in fact, I've now turned around and said it's a wonderful thing. It really keeps you up to date. They're very well presented. The courses, whether they're actually going to the courses or filling in the Vet News little tests each month, even if they aren't applicable to a dairy vet, it's nice to know what the latest approach is on a cat that's got a displaced aortal valve or something like that. Business skills. Gavin and Rob said, no, business skills are an important reason why our practice is successful. Or the way we market in our practice. I've probably been the main guy on the marketing because I'm a people person. I think I was in the green part of that analysis we did. And in one of the other analogies where Lucy, you're listening to me, Lucy, we had the shark, the owl, the turtle, he was the green one, and then the yellow was the teddy bear. The shark was red, yeah, blue was the owl. Anyhow, so marketing, I'm the green, I get on well with people, I like to interact and so on, and I believe we should all develop that. And then, of course, I was qualified at the time of Professor Hofmeyr, and I'm sure at Honest Report has maintained this very professional attitude and appearance. It is important that. And it's one of the reasons why vets going overseas and doing locums and so on, I believe, certainly in my day, we were snapped up the moment our names appeared on the locum agencies. Our professional attitude and our work ethic, just, they reckoned, was best in the world. And that's something to brag about. Anyhow, I went through this and said, yeah, okay, Rob, Gav, I sort of mulled it over. And I'm a slow thinker. It takes a long time to make a decision. But I decided.